Thanks, Bonani. Let me do what everybody else has been doing when they get the microphone. Let me... Amandla! But perhaps let me make a slogan which perhaps we haven't heard very often. We probably might have heard Viva AIDC, Viva! Viva! But have you heard anybody saying Viva Amandla, Viva? Not yet. It sounds a bit odd. It sounds a bit odd. But there is something which we would like to have live long, and that is the Amandla publication, which is an important part of the merged organization that is AIDC. But I cannot say anything really without acknowledging the staff, not of the present AIDC, but many of the staff of AIDC who have come through these doors and corridors and made and developed the foundation upon which this merger is based. And there are many of them here. I just see Vinola's face shining there. But, you know, many of you won't know that when Andre introduced the band, well, there's a lot of continuity because Andre was one of the first people. In fact, if anybody can take pride in the resource center that we have, it's actually Andre Marais' work that we have there. And then there are so many others. If I try to say their names, I'm going to miss some and I'm going to make some big faux pas. So I'm not going to do that. But of course, many of you know the contribution that you've made and the possibility that this merger represents. Now, there are dangers when you retread, like you know, the danger of retreading old politicians, retreading old and abused and misused directors has their problems. As you know, when you talk about the new AIDC, I'm reminded of other news, you know, the new Labour Party in Britain, the new ANC, etc. You immediately can understand the new National Party, you can understand the dangers that I'm referring to. But there is a continuity which I think is extremely important for us to both celebrate and to see how we as AIDC will take this forward. And that is the work of AIDC linking local issues to the macro issues, linking the local issues to the global issues. And that's what really was the birth of AIDC. It was an attempt to say that the development model, the development process in South Africa, as it was in the early 90s or mid-90s, was something that we couldn't be myopic about. We have to understand that that was going to be taking place within a global context and within a macro context which had many threats and dangers. And these we saw very quickly when the RDP, the Reconstruction and Development Program, was abandoned for the Growth and Employment and Redistribution Program here. And so I think it's this methodology that AIDC wants to take forward in terms of being able to sensitize, to link up with community and local struggles and amplify them and point out and develop the linkages between those and the ways in which they impact on the process of justice and social justice, or oppression as the case is. And here I want to point to something that was very important in the history of AIDC and which stands as a model, I think, for us to take forward. And that is when we were presented with gear, we didn't say Panzi gear in the first instance. I mean, we said that behind closed doors because there were not many people that echoed that sentiment at the time in 1996. But we took one of the foundations upon which gear was based. That is the rationale that the South African government inherited this apartheid debt, and therefore we couldn't continue with the redistribution program, and therefore we had to adopt neoliberalism, we had to cut budgets, we had to deregulate, we had to liberalize and privatize. And so we took this issue of the debt, we researched it, and we came up and developed a campaign that said, why should we, the victims of apartheid, pay twice for apartheid? And by mobilizing people around the around the debt issue, we were able to open up the perspectives and visions to say, it's not just the question of debt, it's the larger issue of the macroeconomic program, and even that is not sufficient. We need to understand it within the nature of global capitalism at that time. And AIDC spoke about the impact of globalization on South Africa. And here it's so ironic in a sense, and so appropriate to have Gillian Hart speaking here, because she alerted us to the one-dimensional notion of this impact of globalization. She warned us in her book, Disabling Globalization, not to see it as a unilinear process, as a simplistic binary, but to see the way in which national processes intersected with these global processes. And that alerted us to the role of the South African state and South African capital. Often we looked at the transition in South Africa, the shift away from an emancipatory project, and a shift away from the promises of liberation to the whole processes of unemployment, the closing of industries, the decimation of the leather industries and the textile industries and so on. We saw that that wasn't something that was authored by the IMF and the World Bank imposing it on South Africa, but was very much pertinent to the way in which capital was restructuring. And I'm happy that when we have the merger with AIDC and Amandla, we take forward a very important conference that Amandla did last year on the ways in which it was titled Capitalism, Post-Apartheid Capitalism, Continuities and Discontinuities. And there we accounted for the transition, not just through the Machiavellian machinations of Thabo Mbeki, who had suddenly become a neoliberal, but we looked at the structural forces in South Africa that were pushing the South African state in this direction. And that rich analysis, bringing together the national, the global, looking at how the local also shapes the national, I think it's something that is very much part of the history of AIDC, and which, in the ways in which Mark was outlining, we obviously want to take forward in AIDC. And we take it forward, I think, and just hooking up with what Gillian was reminding of, through the prism of this global crisis. A global crisis which for AIDC is not simply an economic crisis, but a crisis of a system, and which has many different elements to it, including food, including energy, but most importantly, the ecological. And I think it's through the ecological, I think it's through the crisis of climate change that we can understand the limits of capital and the absolute necessity of an alternative to capital and to capitalism itself. And I think it's in this context that AIDC wants to work, in being able to tell the stories